We're trying to reverse this question and make it philosophical. And that is, how does brain activity result in mental life? How do just neurons end up in consciousness? So the scientists say it's emergent property. And today we're reversing that question. We're going to try to reverse it and show you an example of someone else who talks a lot about what that reversal would look like. Bad professor here to try to mess everything up for you, make fun of science, and also reverse this question in particular, this emergent situation where the brain activity results in consciousness and everyone's asked to go look for what that would be. How does that emergence happen when you're talking about just basic neurons, electrical and chemical discharges, and how that extends and becomes life, consciousness? I call life and consciousness the same thing, whatever you want to call it. The question is how to resolve that. Peter Fenwick who has said that maybe we have that reversed. Maybe looking for it as an emergent property of the brain is the mistake. We have the brain, we have the mental life. Are those two things the same? The scientific perspective that's shoved down our throat today is that physical brain and everything it does has this experience attached to it that we call mental life and consciousness, which basically just means somehow from that mental activity in the physical brain, we get this life as a kind of afterthought or a byproduct of it. The best way to think about this is in philosophy, which one is meaningful? The brain or the mind? The brain or the consciousness? Which one has the meaning? And so maybe they both have meaning. But I think we get a lot of meaning out of the physical brain. We can touch it, investigate it. Science does all its stupid science stuff with it. That's a sort of meaning. So is there meaning in the mind, if we separate here brain and mind? Um, is there meaning in it? And the answer today that's shoved down our throat is no. And it's done through this emergent property outline, which is that somehow the physical brain has this other thing that we call consciousness or subjective experience, or in my particular case, I call it life, bro. So for the scientists, it just doesn't have the same kind of meaning. It's just an experience which is relegated to a simple experience, not a thing. So Peter Fenwick is British. He is an MD. He's also an MD FRC psych. I like this because it's fellow of the Royal Society psych. I think I've got that right, which means he's like a doctor in Britain, but upgraded. And so Peter Fenwick is a neuropsychiatrist who talks a lot about consciousness. This is his thing. He also specializes in what's called NDEs. Now, to me, this is my loop theory that you phrase these questions better, you become more philosophical, and then you digress. You say, is it wrong to look at it going from brain to mind? Maybe you should look at it from mind to brain, which he does. But then leave it at that, bro. Don't go looking for God or NDEs. What I thought was interesting was he nuances the argument by saying the brain turns back on. So after you pass, about 5 minutes later, you get an electrical surge or electrical charge that comes back on in the brain. And so a lot of people say, well, that's actually your NDE, when in fact, according to him, this is just a natural process and it wouldn't result in anything that we call all of these mental experiences. In fact, the brain is still turned off, which is to say, after a couple, it's 11 seconds. So after 11 seconds of com- complete loss of electrical activity in the brain, it turns off, which means these experiences people have after that 11 seconds shouldn't be resulting in the NDE. I'm done. That's all I'm saying. So consciousness, but let's talk about what he says. So he says, if you think about, this is explaining it, this is explaining that alternate way of thinking of the whole problem in contrast to the emergent theory of science. So he's still a scientist, but he says, think about the way the eyes work. So what the eyes do is they filter out light. So there's this wide light spectrum, and what the eye does, the human eye at least, is it picks out a tiny bit of that spectrum to give us the information we need about certain colors. What he wants you to think about is the color spectrum being this huge, broad range of visual things, but the human eye filters out a tiny part of that. So what he wants to say about the brain as an organ is that consciousness is like that light spectrum. So consciousness is this huge field. So he wants you to think of the brain the same way you think of the eye. It filters a tiny bit of that. So when we think about what the brain can do, it's basically filtering out what the human needs from this field human brain looks at a small part of that field and takes in what becomes our subjective experience, just like the eye takes in what becomes our color palette. He wants you to think about how that works, how that as a question and as an outline would replace what has been for a while this dominant theory of um, conscious life, subjective experience being this shadow, almost like a dream of what's really going on in the physical brain, which is really all we are, which is really all that has meaning. So, in contrast to that, he's saying the brain is actually just a filter, which means consciousness is the fundamental thing, not the body. So, consciousness and the consciousness field or whatever it is, this part of our world, which we have a small bit of access to, just like the color spectrum, this is what we take in and experience directly as our conscious experience and our conscious life. And this is adding meaning. So he's not just giving you an alternate outline, he's giving you a more meaningful one, which has, in fact, reversed this question. So consciousness is not emerging from mind because brain is just a simple organ that's letting us peer into this greater fundamental, meaningful realm, which is consciousness. So he calls it, quote, an external property of the universe itself. So you would think of consciousness being a part of nature, like gravity. So you have gravity, and we experience a small part of that, especially on Earth, where we can only experience the gravity that affects us exactly in the way it affects us on Earth, and then the light spectrum. And then we have consciousness being another one of these fields, another one of these things of nature, of external reality, which means fundamental to if we were here, it'd still be here. And so our brain is just that eye, that little filter that we use to see what we need from that larger, more fundamental thing. So this is his outline. He thinks he can prove it. He also thinks he can prove NDEs. This is one of the more articulate in terms of what it would look like. That's Peter Fenwick pushing for a more panpsychic, everything is consciousness, and probably more spiritual outline